Most of us are used to just checking one box on the ballot. But what if that's not really the best way to pick our leaders? Today, we're going to dig into two alternative ideas that are shaking up elections around the country, and they really force us to ask, what do we actually want our vote to do?
Or maybe even worse, that you're stuck choosing the lesser of two evils instead of the person you're genuinely excited about. Yeah, it's a super common feeling, and it's the exact problem these other voting systems are trying to fix. So first up, let's look at a system that asks you to think beyond just your number one pick. We're going to dive into a pretty fascinating case study here, a hypothetical 2025 Democratic mayoral primary in New York City. You've got a crowded field, and this system, which is designed to find a true majority winner, got put to the test, and believe me, the results were pretty surprising. So, at its core, ranked choice voting, or RCV, is actually pretty simple. Instead of just picking your favorite, you create a list. You're basically telling the system, look, this is my first choice, but if they don't win, here's my second, and here's my third, and you can keep going. But how does that ranking actually decide who wins? Well, you can think of it like an instant runoff election. First, they count up everyone's number one picks. If somebody gets more than 50% right off the bat, boom, election's over, they win. But if not, the candidate in last place gets eliminated. And here's the magic part. Their votes aren't just tossed out. They get redistributed to whoever those voters picked as their second choice. And that process just keeps repeating until one candidate finally gets over that 50% line. So let's see how this played out in our New York race. Polling showed it was going to be a close one. In this Emerson College poll, you had former Governor Andrew Cuomo in the lead with 35% of first-choice votes. Right behind him was Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani at 32%, and then Comptroller Brad Lander with 13%. Now, in a normal most votes win system, Cuomo's the frontrunner, no question. But since nobody's over 50%, the rankings kick in. And this is where you really see the power of RCV. After Lander, who is in third, got eliminated, his voters' second choices became everything. Now, it's pretty likely that his supporters and Mamdani's supporters had similar ideas. And sure enough, a lot of them had ranked Mamdani as their number two. So those votes just transferred right over to Mamdani, and that surge pushed him past Cuomo to a 52% to 48% win in the simulation. So he wasn't the top first choice, but he ended up being the candidate with the broadest agreement once the race got smaller.
That sounds pretty good, right? Your vote gets to have more of a say. But there's a little bit of a catch. What happens if your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice all get knocked out early? This leads to one of the biggest criticisms of RCV.
It's a thing called an exhausted ballot. And what that means is your ballot is basically out of the game because every single candidate you ranked is no longer in the running. Your vote just stops being part of the count in those final most important rounds. And listen, this isn't just some theory, it's a real thing. Look at Alaska's 2022 special election for Congress. This was a huge deal. A candidate named Nick Begich got eliminated, and of all the people who voted for him, a massive 20.7%, that's more than 1 in 5, hadn't ranked either of the final two candidates. So their ballots just became exhausted. They had zero say in who ultimately won. So yeah, while RCV gives your vote more potential power, there's no guarantee it'll make it all the way to the finish line. Okay, so that brings us to a completely different way of doing things, one that's all about simplicity and just showing broad support. For this, we're going to look at another hypothetical, the mayoral primaries in St. Louis, which actually uses a system called approval voting. Approval voting is just built on a totally different philosophy. You can see the difference right here. RCV is all about making this detailed, ranked list. Approval voting, it's more like drawing a line in the sand. You just look at the list of candidates and you check off or approve of every single one you think is acceptable. You can pick 1, 2, all of them. It's totally up to you. The whole idea is just incredibly easy to grasp. There are no rankings, no rounds of elimination. You just give a vote to every candidate you'd be okay with seeing in office, and at the end of the day, the person with the most total approval votes wins. It's literally that simple. And people really do take advantage of this flexibility. In our hypothetical 2025 St. Louis primary, the average voter approved of 1.4 candidates. So that shows you people aren't just bullet voting, just picking their one favorite. They're actually using their vote to show support for a wider group of candidates they find acceptable.
I think this analogy just nails it. RCV is kind of like filling out a detailed survey. Approval voting? It's way more like hitting the like button. You're not saying who you like the most, you're just saying who you like, period. But there's a really interesting strategic side to this, too. Because you can approve of more than one person, you can kind of build a coalition right there on your ballot. If there's one candidate you absolutely do not want to see win, you can approve of all their main rivals, basically teaming up with other voters to block the person you're against. And you can actually see this strategy in the St. Louis data. We're looking at ballots where voters approved of every candidate except for one. In 2025, almost 65% of these anyone but votes were all aimed at one candidate, Tishara O. Jones. That's a really clear signal of some strong, unified opposition from a big group of voters.
Okay, so we've got two really different systems on the table. One is asking for a super detailed, nuanced ranking of who you like. The other is just asking for a simple, broad show of support. So let's put them right next to each other and see how they stack up.
So what's the bottom line here? Well, RCV is really all about measuring the depth of your preference. Who's your first choice, your second, your third. Approval voting, on the other hand, is about the breadth of your support. RCV's big pro is that it can find those compromise candidates, like we saw in New York. The con, it can be complicated and you have that risk of exhausted ballots. Approval is super simple, and it totally gets rid of the spoiler effect. You know, where a third-party candidate can accidentally help the person you like least. The downside is that it treats your absolute favorite candidate the same as someone you just think is fine.
So, after looking at how these work, the real-world examples, the good and the bad, where does all this leave us? Well, it really points to a much bigger, more fundamental question about what we want an election to even be.
You know, this isn't really a math problem. When you choose between ranking your candidates or just approving of them, what you're really doing is choosing a set of values. You're making a statement about what kind of winner you think an election should produce.
And that's really what it all boils down to. Is the goal to find the person who has the absolute strongest, most dedicated base of first-choice supporters, something that RCV is pretty good at finding? Or is the goal to find the person who ticks off the fewest people and is seen as acceptable to the widest possible group, that consensus candidate that approval voting is built to identify? There's no single right answer here, but it's the big question we have to ask ourselves when we think about the future of how we vote.